Assalamu alaikum. Hello and good afternoon. I hope that the Ramadan is going well, inshallah. You are listening to Atiyah on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show on Ramadan Radio Wolverhampton, online on ramadanradiowolves.com. In the show, we hope to provide information that may be helpful to support your well-being and the well-being of others, because everyone's mental health matters. You can listen back to this and previous shows on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel, alongside finding further information on my X feed at Atiyah Ali3. We are not here to offer you any advice in place of your clinician. However, we will share information that might encourage you to seek support. If you feel you need to discuss your health and well-being following this show, then please contact your GP. You are welcome to send comments regarding the show via the WhatsApp messaging number on 07440 420 432. That's 07440 420 432. In the show today, we will be focusing on understanding trauma, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and seeking support. We have our guest, Senussi, who is a CBT therapist. She is a BABCP accredited cognitive behavioral therapist and EMDR therapist. She has worked as a therapist for nearly 14 years, starting her journey in 2010, working in the NHS. She has extensive experience of working with depression and anxiety disorders, and currently is working with complex trauma. Thank you for joining us today, Senussi, sorry. That's a great introduction.
That's okay. Yes, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ramadan, inshallah, is going well for everybody. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll go straight into this topic. I mean, what is post-traumatic stress disorder? Tell us a little bit about it, the signs and symptoms. When does it tend to occur?
Okay, yes, absolutely. So PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a condition that occurs as a consequence of exposure to a traumatic event. Exposure to either threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. In this context, when we talk about exposure, well, it can mean a number of different things. And when we're looking at sort of the criteria for PTSD, obviously, exposure would mean being sort of subject of a traumatic event, i.e. sort of in a car accident, or being sort of a victim of a mugging or some kind of violent episode. You could also sort of experience PTSD if you witness an event as well. So there's four particular criteria that are kind of mentioned within the diagnostic criteria about sort of how you can experience PTSD. And one of those is witnessing the event, i.e., for example, a domestic violence situation where you see somebody being sort of hurt, or in that situation, i.e. a child watching sort of violence from perpetrator to the victim. A hearing of a close family member or a friend experiencing trauma or death. So for example, there was one time when I hadn't sort of had any training in PTSD, but I was working sort of as a therapist with low intensity therapy at the time. But I did an assessment on a lady who she'd heard about her father and her brother she was living in England and they were living in a sort of Middle Eastern country, and they were taken in by the police. They were tortured and then subsequently they died. They were killed by the police and in their country. And she started experiencing sort of flashbacks and nightmares. She was having nightmares to the event, even though she wasn't there. But because she was told about what happened. For me, it was the first time that I heard of a situation where you can actually hear about sort of a violent, traumatic death or sort of injury, and actually be sort of subject to PTSD yourself. But yes, so that's another way that you can actually experience PTSD. And also, if you sort of experience repeated or extreme exposure to details of traumatic events. And what I mean by that is if you're a first responder, so often first responders, as we know, are sort of ambulance, paramedics, firefighters, policemen. So when they come to sort of events where they come to sort of situations where they see people sort of either injured or or have passed away, then obviously they can also experience PTSD. What we do know about PTSD is that sort of when we hear about PTSD, we think instantly of army veterans, don't we? And people in war. But definitely, PTSD is something that in lots of different situations, exposure to traumatic events can actually create those sort of symptoms in us, let's say. So there is sort of exclusion criteria for PTSD, and I think we're going to sort of talk about this. Sort of, I think one of the questions you're going to ask me is about vicarious trauma. So we'll probably talk about a little bit more about that. But the exclusion criteria would be, for example, watching content from electronic media, TV programs, news broadcasts, and I suppose in light of the current climate, and I will talk a little bit more about that sort of later on in sort of the interview, but that doesn't necessarily create PTSD. So, and I think this was a serious topic when 9/11 happened, I think. I don't know if you remember sort of what happened with 9/11 and sort of the Twin Towers and then there was this kind of, well, there were people who were wondering whether or not observing that would mean that you would get vicarious trauma through sort of sort of just observing sort of the news and observing actually what happened in the Twin Towers. But actually they found that doesn't create PTSD. And I think it is that personal element, as I said earlier, sort of, and hearing about kind of, the kind of the trauma that if somebody's close to a family member, hearing about their death or hearing about sort of the torture, that kind of thing, that can really sort of impact sort of people's mental health quite severely.
You mentioned there kind of 4 areas, didn't you? 4 kind of clear areas where people can experience trauma or are said to have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. And quite rightly, lots of people kind of associate this to war veterans.
Yes.
And it is kind of dispelling that myth, as well as thinking of the signs and symptoms.
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, we'll look at the symptoms as well, but in terms of PTSD, there are lots of situations that can create sort of PTSD in an individual, so post-traumatic stress in an individual. And some of the situations, I'm just so for example, if you experience sort of torture, if you experience repeated sort of physical assault or sexual abuse, and in particular, sort of if there's sexual abuse in childhood as well, and that can create a complex trauma, which we will talk a little bit more about, which is sort of the area that I work in. In terms of the symptoms of PTSD. So there are 4 main symptoms of PTSD. So what we talked about was kind of the conditions that can create trauma, but the symptoms of PTSD themselves. So there's 4 main symptoms. So one of them is re-experiencing intrusions. And so what this means is basically often people will re-experience recurrent, involuntary and intrusive memories of the traumatic event. This, as I said, it's involuntary, so it's not something that we can sort of stop from happening. It tends to happen, and usually there is a trigger for it, but not always. Also, people experience dreams, so recurrent dreams and nightmares in which the content of the or emotions are related to the traumatic event itself. Um, Also, physiological reactions to internal or external cues that resemble aspects of the trauma. So, what that means is, for example, feelings maybe that we experience during the traumatic experience. If we feel them again, then that can be a trigger for us experiencing.
Right. So emotions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
also flashbacks, and these can be sort of involuntary and recurrent. So sometimes we don't always know what triggers those flashbacks. And a flashback is also thought of as disassociation. There's different types of disassociation as well, and I will talk about those as well. But definitely, sort of, those are when we talk about re-experiencing intrusions. Those are the things that we're sort of looking for when we're trying to sort of think about PTSD and diagnosing that. Hypervigilance is the next symptom. So hypervigilance is, I suppose it's defined as marked alterations in arousal and reactivity. So basically, what that means is that obviously arousal is our fight and flight. It's what happens when we are sort of when we're aroused, when we're kind of fearful of something. And I don't know if your listeners are understand sort of fight and flight and what that means, but that
You
is.
can tell us a little bit about it,
Yeah,
actually.
of course, absolutely.
That's helpful.
So fight and flight is our system. It's our kind of internal warning system telling us if something is dangerous or not. It's physiological, so it's it's controlled by something called the amygdala within the brain, and it kind of is controlled by our base emotions. And what I mean by that is the emotions that we feel, like fear, like panic, like anxiety. So very sort of base emotions. It's not an intuitive system, but it is a protective system. So basically, your fight and flight can be triggered. For example, most people, if they've gone for a job interview, their fight and flight is triggered, isn't it? Even though it's not a life-threatening situation, but it's still triggered. And what happens is when it's triggered is you get the physiological arousal. So you get your heart beats faster, your sort of breathing rate increases, you start to sweat. Some people have sort of muscle, the legs and their arms start shaking because of obviously the adrenaline that's released in the body. And all of this is to help to kind of protect you. And like I said, it's not a very intuitive system, but it's a system that's designed to help support us when we need it. So it gives us power, it gives us energy, it gives us an ability to be able to face whatever situation that we're in. Now, obviously, when we're talking about the alterations in arousal through PTSD, then that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that triggering of the fight and flight, and how sort of sometimes we can react to situations in that way automatically without us even sort of realizing that this is happening. And sometimes the fight and flight can be the problem itself, because people don't realize why, or they don't know why their bodies are reacting in that way. And so it becomes a bit of a problem in itself. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And then sort of hypervigilance can also include sort of an exaggerated startle response. So often I see this when I'm speaking to people who've got PTSD, that they are startled by loud sounds, they're startled by sort of sudden movements. Sometimes I find that people walking in the street, somebody's walking behind them, they're generally sort of quite worried and looking back, and loud sounds. Like, for example, if somebody was involved in a car accident, often the sound of the car revving can create that kind of anxiety. So they're hypersensitive to those sounds and those situations. And also with hypervigilance, we're looking at sort of a marked sort of angry outbursts and aggressive behavior sometimes with very little provocation. And it is a kind of an instinctive thing, because obviously, and anger is quite typical in post-traumatic stress disorder. People often afterwards feel, a sense of guilt and shame about it, but it's part of, unfortunately, it is sort of quite it does seem to sort of increase with PTSD. So that's hypervigilance. And then we have avoidance. So avoidance is sort of avoiding sort of external reminders of sort of situation, people, places, or things that are associated with the trauma. For example, in terms of, say, let's go back to that sort of example of a car accident. People might avoid going into a car again. They might avoid driving. They might avoid going to the road that, where they had the accident. They might, or they'll do it, but they'll have somebody with them. So there's a lot of sort of safety behaviors that they incorporate within their sort of life. And what that does is it makes your life smaller. It makes your world smaller because you're not doing the things that maybe you used to do, or you're struggling to do things because of the way you feel around sort of being in that environment or that situation again. But also avoidance, or efforts to avoid internal reminders, like thoughts, memories, feelings that are associated with the trauma. We do something called thought suppression. And I don't know if, as a CBT therapist, I think you yourself, so does it ever work when we try and suppress our thoughts, or does that ever work?
Not at all.
No.
Really?
Yeah. So we're constantly sort of fighting this battle with trying to stop ourselves from thinking about things that unfortunately seep through and just create a lot more distress. And our last sort of symptom to think about when we're thinking about PTSD is negative alterations in thinking and mood. So basically, this is an inability to remember aspects of the event due to disassociation. Now, disassociation often occurs because, and this is a biological thing, it's not something that we tend to do on purpose. When people experience trauma, or when they experience a traumatic event, the brain often will sort of try and protect them. So what happens is it can create a dissociative moment where we're not fully present in that situation. And that's because of the extreme emotions that we experience as a consequence of that. And it is usually around this belief that, I might die, something bad's going to happen, or I'm going to, lose a loved one, because obviously, when we're talking about sort of witnessing traumatic events. And disassociation, when it happens, the issue around that is that it doesn't allow the memory to be embedded into our memory stores. And this is one of the reasons why post-traumatic stress disorder can be persistent. We will talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's an important part of this, understanding PTSD and I suppose understanding the treatment for it as well. But, I suppose one way to understand disassociation, and how I would explain it to my clients, is we all have an autopilot. We all sometimes, go through autopilot. I mean, most people will do certain activities through autopilot, and often, when I'm driving, sometimes, especially if I'm doing a route that I've done so many times, I get from A to Z and I don't realize that I've got there because I've been thinking about other things. And it's the same with if I'm washing dishes, it's not really the most interesting activity. So often my mind is doing other things, and that, in one sense, that is a very that is disassociation, but to sort of one end of the spectrum. So it's not disassociation because of distress. It's more about sort of, this is an activity I've done so many times, so I will, I don't need to focus on it. When we're with PTSD, however, often it is because of the emotions that we experience. And so the body will it almost doesn't want to be, it doesn't want to experience that distress. And so it shuts down. And when it shuts down, the trauma memory is broken up into little pieces, and it's floating around in the brain, and it's not stored away. And the problem with that is that we never process the memory. And so this is why, or this is what we think one of the reasons for trauma triggers to come up is because that memory hasn't been stored away. And that's an important element. That's an important thing to understand when we come to look at trauma treatment as well. So in terms of disassociation, and it has to be due to disassociation that people don't remember aspects of the event, rather than, because often with trauma, people often adopt different behaviors to help them to manage their distress. And some people may turn to drug or alcohol abuse, and that also will have an impact on remembering and memory. So if that is what it's down to, and it's not disassociation, then obviously it's a different sort of way of working. You have to kind of work with that first before you can start to think about anything else. Or the consequence of head injury as well, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
But also with this negative alteration in thinking and mood, it's also feelings of negativity towards oneself, which often, as a consequence of a trauma, and especially complex PTSD. And I'll talk to you about the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD in a minute. Yeah. So often the feelings of negativity towards oneself are sort of elevated within PTSD, and feelings of detachment and estrangement from others, and also an inability to experience positive feelings as well. So those are the four main symptoms that we look for. Would you like me to go on to sort of different types of trauma?
We could do. I'm just noticing the time, and we're coming towards a break.
Okay.
A short break, and we'd love for you to pick this up on the other side. But so far, it's been very interesting in terms of sharing with our audience the symptoms of PTSD. And I suppose you talked about them being internal or external cues, things like flashbacks, being hypervigilant, avoiding things. You talked about thoughts and kind of blocking those thoughts, suppressing those thoughts, trying not to think of those thoughts, and thinking of other areas like the negative alteration in thinking. So all of these are very interesting areas in terms of internal or external cues with regards to PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. These conditions that create trauma sometimes can go missed. And I think it's very important that you shared that with us, and quite extensively. Thank you.
Okay.
After the break, we will pick up on this, and we'll talk about what you mentioned there in terms of complex trauma. And also I'm thinking about adverse childhood experiences and wonder what roles that plays in trauma. And you hinted at that earlier. So thank you for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you after the break.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome back. You're listening to Atiyah on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show. And before the break, you were listening to May Senussi, who is a cognitive behavioural therapist and an EMDR therapist. Thank you again for joining us, May.
Thank you for having me.
Before the break, we were talking about trauma, and in particular, adverse childhood experiences. And what I mean by that is, you mentioned that when you're a child, and if people have experienced domestic abuse, for example, or witnessed domestic abuse, it can be presented in the therapy room again as an adult. Would you say that would be an experience of PTSD, depending on the symptoms?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, different types of PTSD. So what we know is that, you can have a single event trauma, for example, and that's one event that happens, say a car accident or sort
Mm,
of a violent sort of attack or something, and that's a single event trauma. Then you have your multiple event traumas, so you could have multiple car
mm,
accidents. But then you also have your complex trauma or your type. So you've got type 1, type 2, and then your type 3 traumas, which is your complex trauma. And that would probably, when you're talking about adverse childhood experiences, that will probably be part of that type 3 trauma or that complex trauma. And yeah, absolutely experiencing violence and abuse or neglect, witnessing violence in the home or the community, having a family member attempt or die by suicide. These are all sort of things that can create sort of a complex trauma, substance use problems, mental health problems. So all of these things can kind of undermine a child's sense of safety and stability
mm,
and bonding. And obviously, children are they're very as a child, we use the term egocentric to describe children's ability to understand the world because they don't understand experience, they don't understand context. They understand themselves and their world and who they are. And if trauma is happening to a child every other day or every day, or if they're seeing it, then their world isn't safe. And so that therefore they can build sort of belief systems that can be quite sort of unsafe. The world isn't safe. I'm not safe. I'm not loved. I'm not,
mm,
so very kind of those core beliefs can be quite negative, which then obviously will impact how they interact with the world and how they sort of, bond with people. And that will create problems with relationships, it'll create problems with sort of how they see themselves, what they do. So yes, absolutely. It is sort of an important thing to understand with
mm,
complex or sort of complicated sort of traumas. And it is something that I think society needs to tackle because a lot of the time, these things can happen um, due to sort of malfunctioning sort of societies, poverty, various things like that that can bring those instabilities for children. So it is something not just the individual, and I think this is the issue. It's not just the family or the individual. I think it's we as a society need to start to think about how we support our young people and how we can help people through,
mhm,
some of the things that they experience on a day to day. Um, and many sort of traumatic experiences could also impact health and well-being. What we know about adverse childhood experiences is that often, it does lead to chronic health problems. It can lead to mental illness and substance use problems in adolescence and in adulthood. So we need to be able to kind of and negatively impact things like education, job opportunities, earning potential, because not only does sort of their experiences not allow them to kind of move forward in their lives, but it also creates PTSD and complex traumas, which then have a negative impact on their ability to move forward in their lives. So yeah, absolutely, really, really important thing to think about, Tia. Atiyah, I do apologize.
that's okay. They told me both. Mate, why is this often referred to as complex trauma then? I mean, you touched upon it there. Is there anything
Yeah.
you'd like to add?
Yeah, so complex trauma is, as I said, it's kind of like what tends to happen with complex trauma is okay. So if we think about complex trauma, it is about it happens after exposure to an event or series of events of an extremely threatening or horrific nature,
Mm.
most commonly prolonged or repetitive events which escape from is difficult or impossible. So, and things
Can you
like
give an example?
torture, slavery, genocide campaigns, prolonged domestic violence, repeated childhood sexual or physical abuse. So those are the things that kind of can create complex trauma, because there's also this idea of learned helplessness and an inability to kind of help yourself. And so, the person is almost sort of given up to a certain degree. And again, as we talked about earlier, leads to that negative self-belief. So to be diagnosed with complex trauma, you have to have PTSD symptoms have to be fulfilled. So you have to experience the four symptoms that we talked about. But also with complex trauma, we're looking for sort of other symptoms as well. So those symptoms are we're looking for sort of emotion regulation difficulties, so difficulty in regulating your emotions. So your emotions, you experience so anger to you know sort of anxiety, panic, all of those things, and not being able to actually regulate those emotions. Difficulties in maintaining and forming relationships, so not being able to kind of form relationships with other people, and also a negative self-belief, a negative self-concept that goes beyond just I'm not good at this or I'm not good at that. It goes beyond that, and it's more about I am worthless. And so those three conditions, as well as sort of the PTSD sort of symptoms, we then sort of think about more complex or complicated traumas for the individual. The difficulty with this is that obviously when you work with complex trauma, you're not only sort of trying to process the traumas, you're also trying to help them to kind of build relationships and learn how to be in sort of relationships, learn about themselves, so kind of build their self-esteem. So there's a lot more work that goes into it. The tenets of it is actually working with the PTSD, working with the memories, but because it's prolonged, repeated sort of traumatic experiences, that can be it can take sort of a while to build those relationships as well, and to work with people within sort of with complex trauma, because if you can imagine, if people have this belief that the world can't be trusted and the world isn't safe, then thinking about a therapist relationship, this is also a relationship, isn't it? And you need them to be able to trust you in order to believe that actually you can help them and support them.
Sure.
And so that then also can be a bit of a problem, if that makes sense, because people don't trust because they've been let down so much, and they've had those experiences where it becomes ingrained into their kind of psyche almost.
Yeah, sounds like repeated long-term experiences of trauma.
Absolutely.
Do we have an understanding of the number of people that might be experiencing PTSD at any one time? Are there any stats out there for that?
Yeah. So I did a bit of research myself, and I found that actually 4 in 100 people, this is in the UK, are expected to have PTSD at any given time in the UK. This doesn't include complex PTSD though. So this equates to something like 2,612,000 or something like that, and this is according to PTSD UK. We know that women are more likely to screen positive for PTSD than men, whether there is more of a because women tend to sort of speak out, don't they, a lot more than men. Men tend to not sort of talk about their traumatic experiences, and that's just a discrepancy, in general, really.
It could be that women are experiencing trauma more so, and at the same time they're reporting
it a lot more. Absolutely. And also, interestingly, from Mind, talk about sort of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities are at a higher risk of developing a mental health problem in adulthood, but less likely to receive support for it. Whether that is, again, the lack of reporting and how they, because I think some of these things are obtained through sort of reports of people experiencing distress and sort of going through that route rather than actually reporting that they have a mental health issue. It's when they get to a point where they're, very, very distressed and they either try and harm themselves or do something, and that's where they get these statistics from. I know that 8%, it says also, I think this is mined as well, that 8% of Black British adults have symptoms relating to PTSD compared to 4% of their white British counterparts. And that is, and thinking about it, the Black and the Black British population is much, much smaller, but and yet their statistic is much higher. Which is interesting, isn't it? And then more Asian and British Asian adults screen positive for PTSD compared to their white counterparts again, and also I think Asian or Asian British Pakistani men have the lowest recovery rates for IAP talking therapies. That's again, it's quite disappointing, really, because it feels as though we're failing people a little bit here, in some way.
So when you mention IAPT there, you're talking about primary care services, frontline, in terms of first port of call for mental health services. And yes, it does seem like a failure. And at the same time, I'm thinking about people from ethnic minorities who might not understand what PTSD is, and it's probably underreported. So there's probably many people who are experiencing symptoms of trauma.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you want to add with regards to what we've been saying there?
Yeah. No, I suppose anecdotally, I've also found, I don't know if you found this, Atiyah, but I found that, I see less minority ethnic people from minority ethnic communities than I do sort of from the general population. And it's a shame, because I feel like we are sort of not helping them, but in a sense, we're not really sort of hitting them where we need to hit them. And
that's what this program is about, increasing awareness and encouraging people to, inshallah, seek the support where required. And I suppose it does depend on which area you're working in also, but generally it does seem that there are less people from ethnic minority communities attending mental health services for support. If they wanted to, what are the treatment options? Could you
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know, introduced me earlier as a cognitive behavior therapist, and that's what I do. So CBT is the treatment of choice for the NHS. We talked about IAP briefly. So improving access to psychological therapies are the services that support people, and they are now nationwide. So you should be able to access an IAP service wherever you are. I would say the first port of call, if you are struggling, is your GP, and your GP will be able to sort of direct you, help you to either refer you to an IAP service or give you the number for you to refer yourself, self-referral. In terms of the GP as well, may be able to give you pharmacological help, so medication. I know sometimes people think about medication and go, "Oh no, thank you. No, I don't want that." But it really is about kind of empowering yourself and giving and understanding, sort of medication, because it's not as bad as people think. It isn't. It's more about helping people to, and especially when we're talking about antidepressants, it's about helping you to do things. It is antidepressants can be very, very helpful, and especially alongside therapy as well. They're not necessarily addictive, and your GP will help you to come off them when you need to, when you find that actually you don't need those anymore. And they can, like I said, they can be very helpful alongside therapy. They're not a quick fix. So people, often think that they take medication and it's a quick fix. It's not a quick fix. That doesn't work like that. Now, CBT is, as I said, it's the recommended sort of treatment option. And for PTSD, it would be trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. and this is recommended by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, or National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. They've changed their name. National Institute for Health and Care Excellence,
Mm-hmm.
which is a non sort of governmental body that kind of provides guidance on evidence-based interventions. So CBT has had sort of various trials, and it's found that actually it has a lot of evidence to suggest that it works really well with mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety disorders, PTSD included in that. So definitely something that can be accessed through your IAPT or your Improving Access to Psychological Services, and privately as well if people want to pay
Yeah.
for sort of treatment. I would go for the BABCP accredited therapist, and I don't know if there's a way to sort of link some information for people. Just
Yeah.
so that they can find a therapist in their area who might be able to offer them CBT or sort of anything else. And also EMDR is also suggested. So I practice EMDR. I've been doing it for a year now. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I love
Excellent.
EMDR.
Mhm.
And I use it a lot because obviously the clients that I see have very complicated, very complex traumas that can span a long, long time. And again, with PTSD, sometimes, there is no time frame. If you may have experienced a traumatic incident years and years and years ago, but sometimes we do our best and we live with, and we do the things that we can do. But if you're still experiencing the symptoms that we talked about, and if you're still sort of struggling, there's no time frame for help. You can go and go to your GP or go and access your IAP service and hopefully get some help with that, and with any mental health disorder, any kind of issues that you may have that you're struggling with. But
Mm.
yeah, so
Thank
um,
you.
I don't know if you want me to talk a bit about EMDR.
Yeah, you can tell us a little bit about EMDR. That's
Yeah.
informative. Thank you, what you've shared so far.
Yeah, that's okay. So EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. We're not 100% certain how it works, but it uses something called bilateral stimulation, which is the movement of the eyes from side to side. They think it mimics REM sleep, why it works, but what it is, it's about processing trauma memories. And that is a tenet of working with trauma. It's about helping you to process your memory so that you can store it away. And cognitive behavior therapy does the same thing, but it's slightly different. It's a different technique. But it's about storing away the memory so that it's not triggered in the same way. And part of the therapy that we do is also about helping people to reclaim their lives, to do the things that maybe they've stopped doing. So if it's a trauma in a car accident, you would process the memory, and then you would help people to maybe do some exposure therapy, working on going back into the car if that's what they want,
Mm-hmm.
or driving, going back to sort of a life that they led prior to the accident. Um, and so sort of trauma focused CBT is really about kind of working on the trauma and helping people to then reclaim their lives, and going back and doing the things that they want to do, um,
Mm.
and rebuilding their lives as well. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
that's okay.
Just wanted to move on quickly, if that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Because we're short of time, and I did want to ask you a question around some of the symptoms that you mentioned earlier
Yeah,
that you described. They sound similar to those that many share with regards to the current atrocities in the Middle East, and
yeah,
um, you know, it leads me to think about vicarious trauma.
yeah.
How do you explain vicarious trauma? Would you be able to share some insight?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So vicarious trauma, you're right in the sense that vicarious trauma doesn't, you don't have to be in the vicinity to get that, but you do have to have a connection. And what I mean by that is, for example, they looked at this. I don't know, we touched on this earlier about 9/11 and what happened after 9/11 and the kind of the fear that you would have a whole nation full of traumatized people. And this was in America, obviously, all this research was done. They found that actually it doesn't impact people in the same way. You can't get PTSD from sort of watching sort of programs like that. The thing that does sort of affect people is if they have a close link to the individual that's harmed. So, for example, if somebody had somebody in the Twin Towers and they were sort of, they kind of observed what happened and this person is, and they saw what happened to their family member or their loved one, then yes, you can get vicarious trauma, but you can't really get it from just observing things like that. So obviously what's happening in Gaza and what's happening sort of around the world, really, everywhere, sort of in Sudan and various other places, it is really, really traumatizing. It is in one sense, but it's not, you won't get PTSD from it. But what you can do, I think, and I think something that we all are trying to do is raise awareness to make sure that the people of Gaza get what they need, really, like you said, I think in your question, Atiyah, lobbying and things like that, doing things, getting your local MPs involved, and just trying to sort of raise sort of funds for people, charity work, all of those things, raising awareness for the people in Gaza. That's really important. But
there is some research that suggests that people who do view disturbing images or traumatic content, they can be affected kind of physically and emotionally and psychologically. And we hear that from people, and we might experience it ourselves in terms of watching those distressing content.
Absolutely.
So sometimes people feel as though they've been there physically, but they're not. And what tends to happen is that those parts of your brain that you mentioned earlier, in terms of the fight or flight, might begin to kind of play a part. I mean, I'm thinking of following particular stories and wondering if the person is okay the next day. So, people become vested in that. How can people kind of protect themselves and keep themselves safe emotionally? And you mentioned their lobbying and things. What about things like grounding exercises? What kind of things can people do?
Absolutely. Yes, actually, I'm glad you actually mentioned that because I think that's a very important element to trauma therapy. Grounding is really important. And one of the things that we find is, excuse me, that people do struggle with grounding, and especially people with complex trauma. So grounding exercises, kind of relaxation and as Muslims, we read the Quran, we do things that help us, Salah. I'm so sorry, I'm just going to have a drink of water.
That's okay. And you're right there. People can look for ways to kind of ground themselves and find positive distractions and support. We're running towards the end of the time. I'm just wondering about any self-help information that might be out there in terms of grounding.
Plenty of self-help, There's lots of websites. If you want, I can send you a link to lots of different websites.
Yeah, please do, and I'll put that on my X feed if that's okay. And that's where people can find it. I've really appreciated your time today, May.
Thank you.
Before you leave, how could people contact you if they wanted to speak to you about?
So if they want to contact me, I do have an email. Would you like me to read that out to you? Or?
Yes, please.
Yep. Right. Sorry, bear with me. I'm just getting that email. Oh, I'm terrible.
No problem. So, thank you to our audience listening today. And as we shared earlier, you can find information on my X feed at Atiyah Ali 3. You can also listen back to this on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Ramadan Radio, Wolverhampton's YouTube channel. You have it there, May?
I do have it, yes. So it's MIE SEY at iCloud.com. So MIESEY at iCloud.com. So it's Maisie at iCloud.com.
Jazakallah for joining us today.
Inshallah. Jazakallah for having me.
Thank you for listening. Really thank you for listening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum for now.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.